Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Stavely, one of the systems architects here at Dataprise. It's my absolute pleasure to be spending the next 90 minutes with you. We've got a lot of information that we're looking forward to sharing with you. Today we're continuing the Ask the vCIO learning series on desktop as a service, enabling the anywhere and the anytime power. I want to take a quick moment to get a few clerical items out of the way. First off, we're going to be recording this webinar. So if you need to share it with your friends and colleagues, there'll be a link that's sent out in a few days that will show you how to get that. Additionally, we're really looking forward to the session being interactive today. So we have a question and answer form. You'll see that on the side of your screen. And we have moderators here who can help get your questions over to me throughout the presentation, and we'll go ahead and get those questions answered for you. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Dan O'Farrell. We are very fortunate and very lucky to have a special guest here today. Dan is the Director of Products for Desktop Virtualization Solutions at Dell. Dan has extensive knowledge, experience, and expertise in virtual desktop infrastructure as well as desktop as a service. Before we get going, I'd like to go ahead and share the agenda with you this afternoon. We're going to start off by giving you a brief snapshot of Dataprise. Then we're going to dive right into talking about desktop as a service. We'll talk about what desktop as a service actually is. We'll talk about the drivers behind organizations who adopt desktop as a service. We'll also talk about the types of organizations who are utilizing desktop as a service today, and furthermore, the types of users in the organization who utilize DaaS today. Lastly, we'll talk about the types of devices that support desktop as a service. So Dataprise is a leading managed service provider. We're regionally based here in the Mid-Atlantic. We have offices that stretch from New York all the way down to the Carolinas, and we also have national reach. We were founded in 1995 and just recently celebrated our 20-year anniversary. We're headquartered right here outside of Washington, D.C., and we consider ourselves a one-stop shop for small and medium-sized businesses. Before we dive into the content of today's webinar, we wanted to start out with a brief poll. We want to find out how many of you out there are currently utilizing desktop as a service or on-premise virtual desktop infrastructure today. You should see a poll pop up on your screen, and we'll give you a brief minute to just answer yes, no, unsure. If yes, please feel free to share what type of desktop as a service solution you guys are using. Great. Looks like we've got a good mix here of folks that both are and are not using desktop as a service. Before we dive in, I wanted to take a brief moment here just to briefly define desktop as a service. We're going to use that terminology throughout the webinar today. So by definition, desktop as a service offers a virtual desktop infrastructure that is hosted by a third-party cloud service provider and is typically based on a monthly subscription fee model. With desktop as a service, your organization's software applications and data are all centralized in a secure virtualized environment in the cloud. DaaS lets your staff access their desktop and personal data from any device, anytime. Additionally, because the application and data is not tied to a specific device, there's no risk for lost data or productivity in the event a device becomes lost, broken, or comes up stolen. Without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dan O'Farrell. Dan, please welcome to the webinar.
Okay, hey, thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. And hello, everybody out there. Appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of what I know about desktop virtualization and DaaS. As we look at this current slide, one analogy I like to make is that DaaS and desktop virtualization, it's a lot like watching television. The way this works is, you're basically looking at content that's coming from elsewhere. When you're at home watching television, what you see on your TV screen You know, that content does not originate from your TV set. It comes from the broadcast networks and the content providers. So let's take a look at some of the drivers that are causing organizations to look toward this newer model of making people more productive while securing their content. If you think about it, and I'm not going to go over all these statistics, but we're in a period of change, right? There are more and more people now using the internet, in excess of 3 billion users, and that rate continues to accelerate over time, not slow down. We've got a lot of people obviously now who are using smartphones, and your smartphone is essentially a little computer capable of consuming content and generating small amounts unto themselves. We've got a lot of mobile applications that are being written for this new type of usage model. Gartner is saying that basically desktop virtualization, which is to move apps and content away from the endpoint device, is one of their top 10 strategic initiatives that they're seeing organizations taking a close look at. And it's especially popular in what we call the mid-market, small to mid-sized companies, and especially desktop as a service. You know, if you're an organization that does not have a really large, technically savvy IT group, one common alternative that people can now consider is to farm out, if you will, a lot of the desktop imaging and patching and update, and let that be delivered to your people as a service. And you can do it either on-premise by using desktop virtualization, or you can work with someone like Dataprise who can offer it as a service to your people. So let's talk about the primary reasons organizations are contemplating this move. Number one is security. What we find at Dell is the primary impetus behind many organizations giving this a very serious look is security. There was a well-chronicled incident a few years ago where a New York banker left his laptop in the back of a cab and all that content was exposed. Another one is empowering your people to be more productive. Taking advantage of mobility and the ability to work from any device. Another one is to make life easier on your IT organization, especially if you don't have a large, technically super savvy IT organization. You want to have someone else worry about it. And then finally, there's a very nice cost impact from all this. And I'll take a little bit of a deeper dive now on each of these 4 areas, starting with security. It's not surprising that a lot of organizations, and obviously given all the news lately about security breaches and espionage, commercial espionage and all that, we remember what happened with Sony Pictures about 1.5 years ago. Security is top of mind with a lot of organizations. And the beauty of going to a DaaS or a VDI model is that you can get your arms around content protection and access control, because you move all of your key apps and content away from the endpoints and into the data center. From that explanation we showed earlier, again, since it's a lot like watching TV, you can set it up so that your certain user groups within your organization can do nothing more than what you allow them to do from their endpoint. So it gives you great control. It helps organizations comply with specific mandates, whether they're federal mandates or commercial mandates, to comply with specific ways in which you either protect content or in many cases protect the confidential information of your customers. For example, healthcare has HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which defines how healthcare organizations must protect patient records and patient information. That cannot be compromised. Retail has the PCI, payment card information mandates that they have to meet. So it turns out that if you move content and apps from hundreds or potentially thousands of endpoints and place them in one place, that being the data center, you have a much better chance of complying with these specific content protection and security mandates. And then the other thing to remember, right, is that data centers from day one are typically designed with very high levels of fault tolerance, disaster recovery, and high reliability. Levels that simply cannot be achieved from a traditional desktop PC. So, typically a data center will have a disaster backup designation, oftentimes in another geographic location. And oftentimes, you'll have just automatic backups. In fact, one little anecdote I could share with you guys is I had a guy working for me last summer. He was an intern, and I had him working on a spreadsheet. And he came to me one afternoon and said, Dan, I don't know what happened. I lost the information, and I can't retrieve my spreadsheet. And I said, don't worry. You're working on a virtual desktop. Just call IT and ask for the 2 o'clock backup from yesterday. And he got it. So there's a really nice reliability factor that's built into this model. Empowering the workforce has everything to do with enabling your people to be as productive as possible while working basically from anywhere and potentially from any device. Because the way DaaS works is for someone to do their job, all they need is the agent software resident on their endpoint to be able to access the apps and content that reside within your secure data center. So this opens up entirely new avenues for productivity for your people. They can basically get to their apps from almost anywhere. So we hear a lot about this concept of matching work style with lifestyle. And if you have employees who yearn to do that, this is a great way to enable that. So if they do want to go to a 2 p.m. soccer game for their kid, they can still do that. They can have a tablet on the sidelines if they want and still stay connected, or from a Starbucks, or from an airport, or from home. So you are no longer tethered to a specific machine to get your work done. And this folds directly into the whole bring your own device phenomenon, right? And it's especially true if you've got things like temporary workers or contractors who want to be able to use a device that they bring in with them. You can allow them to do that by simply enabling them to download the agent, and then they can get to those applications that you dictate are legal for them to get to, and by the way, none that they can't. In fact, you get such a great level of control with the DaaS that you can do things like turn on or turn off USB ports on endpoints. You can set policies where people are not allowed to store anything locally. So there's great control you get. And oftentimes organizations, like healthcare organizations, think of hospitality, hotels, think of car rental agencies who may have front office clerks or front desk clerks. You want them to be as productive as possible, but you can really limit what they can do so they can do just their job and nothing else. By moving to this model, you do reduce the reliability on singular physical hardware assets, right? Because now you can allow people to use devices. Maybe you just did a refresh on your PCs. They haven't depreciated yet, so you use them. Or you've got people who like to work from tablets or laptops. The beauty of it is they can use the device of their choice. And I already mentioned things like, temporary staff. The other advantage of this empowering your workforce is you can bring people up and make them productive very, very quickly. And during periods of merger and acquisition or right sizing, if you want to move somebody from one group into another or repartition the way you're organized, it can be done very quickly and easily because, again, the desktops are virtual. And in fact, updating or patching hundreds or thousands of desktops is as simple as a file drag and drop. It looks like we have a question that just came in.
Great. Yeah, it looks like we do. I had a question, Dan, about what do you do about devices that are disconnected, like when they're in airplane mode, taking an airplane ride?
Yep. Yeah, good question. So some of the brokers actually have a disconnected mode that you can operate in where you can essentially check out the virtual desktop, do work on a train or in an airplane, and then check that desktop back in. So otherwise, it is true that you do need to have a physical, decent networking connection to be attached to your virtual desktop. But there is what is known as kind of checkout mode, which is possible. Both Citrix and VMware, for example, on their brokers enable that type of capability. That's a very good question. By the way, don't hesitate, everyone out there. If you do have questions, feel free to use the text feature on the system. So let's see. I think we have let's see, another poll we'd like to take actually. So for this poll, just feel free to take about a minute to answer the question. The question is this: do you currently have a PC refresh, or do you have a PC refresh coming up within the next 9 months? So are you looking at refreshing your desktops within, say, anytime within the next 9 months? If you can just take a minute to answer that, we'll appreciate it. Your options are yes, no, or unsure. Okay, it looks like most of you have voted, and about 2/3 of you have answered yes to that question. So within the next 9 months or so, you've got a PC refresh on the horizon. The reason we ask that question is because if you are looking at a PC refresh, and typically your PCs will be refreshed every 3 or 4 years, that may be a really good time to consider moving some of your people to this virtual desktop model, this DaaS model. The reason for that is if you're about to invest in a bunch of new PCs anyway, it typically creates a good scenario to go to your CFO, to go to purchasing and say, hey, we may want to take advantage of this other model. It's especially useful for what we call task workers, the people in your organization who do jobs that are fairly repetitive. It's great to kind of start out with that kind of group and then potentially expand from there. Yeah, another question.
Yeah, Dan, looks like another question came in. So question goes, is there an average bit rate for maintaining a decent connection to a virtual desktop session in your experience?
You know, what's happened is these protocols have become so good. They're very, very forgiving if you have kind of a weak link in your network hops. So as long as you have like a decent Wi-Fi connection locally, and then you've got WAN links of say, you know, you don't really need that much capacity. Maybe just a, you know, let me think for a second. I think it's certainly a lot less than 100 megabits is necessary. You can get by with WAN links in the tens of megabits typically. The reason for that is the protocols, if you remember how this works, they're merely painting the pixels on your screen, and that tends to not require a lot of bandwidth. The biggest issue has to do with latency, but the protocols like PC over IP or Citrix HDX have become really, really sophisticated at smoothing out the user experience. Normally people are unhappy with their experience if they see jitter, for example, in video, and these protocols have gotten so good that they're very, very adept at smoothing out the experience. So you don't need very, very fat dedicated WAN links to do this. Under 100 megabits works. You don't need any kind of like gigabit services or anything like that. So in most enterprises, whatever they're using across their WAN is typically good enough.
And Dan, in my experience when I'm traveling too, I mean, I often use my cellular hotspot just to be able to access my desktop. Is that fairly common?
Yeah, that is fairly common. You know, especially if you're in a place that doesn't have Wi-Fi, you can stand up your own little mini Wi-Fi through the cellular network, and that typically for most users gives you more than enough capacity to get to your work. Because if you think about it, most of us are doing things like a Microsoft Office suite, Excel, Word, PowerPoint. The only time you'll ever need more capacity is if you want to run a lot of multiple windows of rich video. Yeah, another question.
I think it was a point of clarification too, Dan, and great explanation too. Gives us a lot of background. Do you have a method for calculating, for example, by session, what you would need in bandwidth so that you could, in your planning, forecast what type of bandwidth was needed?
Yeah, we do that at Dell all the time, and that's a service that can be offered through partners like Dataprise, where we'll take a look at your environment. In fact, before you even embark on a virtual desktop journey or a DaaS journey, it's important to take inventory of your environment, right? What types of workers do you have? What application mix are they running? What are their actual needs from their endpoints? It really just depends on that. And that's a service that we'll offer, and we'll map that out for you to make sure that the users will have a good experience.
Great, and I think not to jump too far ahead, I think towards the end, Dan, we'll be talking more about planning checklist and how to move forward with that. So good questions. We'll continue to chew through the content of the webinar, and then, of course, if there's still additional questions, we have time at the end of the webinar, and of course, we're available every day here. So thanks, Dan.
Yeah, no, and by the way, guys, it's not unusual to be worried about bandwidth and how much capacity you need, but you would be surprised at how little is actually needed to paint the screens on these endpoints, because even with video, for example, you're only showing the changes. So the protocols don't require lots of capacity. Another great outcome of this model for DaaS is that it really frees up your IT organization to be more productive and more streamlined in their own right. If you think about it, by centralizing the control of your desktops, or by simply, offering desktops as a service from your partner, it really frees up your IT organization to be more productive. Because when you think about it, imaging, updating, patching, downloading new releases to hundreds or thousands of desktops is a very time and effort consuming effort for IT. So by moving to a virtual model, it's to think of this. If I want to update or patch 300 desktops, it's a simple file drag and drop on the console in your data center, and you're done. So the amount of labor that's needed, you don't have to visit these endpoints. You can just do it from one spot. It has a huge impact on your IT organization. By centralizing these upgrades and applications and these images, etc., it makes it easier to do it, and also it gives you one spot to get your arms around the various images that you may want to have for different people in different parts of your company. And then by doing this, you can save time for IT and allow those people to be more strategic and productive in their own right. Okay, finally, and this is always a concern, is cost. It turns out that most organizations realize some significant total cost of ownership advantages when they move toward this model. As a DaaS service, you're only paying for what you use, and you're essentially just paying your partner to offer the desktops to your people, and it's a monthly subscription. And most companies realize very quickly that that monthly subscription price, amortized, say, over a year or 3 years, is dwarfed by the cost it would take to update, patch, and maintain hundreds or thousands of desktops. So you can save a lot of money in that way. Another way that you can save a lot of money with this model is you can repurpose your existing hardware. So you don't need new endpoints. You don't need new applications. You can use your existing environment in terms of your apps and your endpoints and simply fold them onto the desktop as a service. And then finally, you may have heard of thin clients or zero clients. These are special purpose devices that are designed specifically to operate as great endpoints in a virtual desktop environment. They oftentimes look a lot more like cable modems or wireless routers than traditional PCs, and they tend to consume between 6 and 15 watts of electricity. If you do the math on that, right, if you're replacing a lot of traditional 200-watt energy class PCs with a 15 or 10-watt endpoint in the form of a thin client, you could save a lot of money just in energy consumption.
Dan, that's a great time to, with regards to these different devices and how to manage cost. We had a question come in about how these DaaS devices access domain and or network resources. For example, being able to print or scan or, maybe perhaps network drives, things of that nature.
Yep. There's basically what we call peripheral redirection is a technology that's used in these environments, because the question is very, very appropriate, right? If your desktop session is running remotely inside the data center and you want to print something out at the printer that's 2 aisles away from you in your office, how do you make that work? And the beauty of this is that with peripheral redirection, it's basically just a configuration parameter that you set up with the identity of that printer, and it's not unlike your Windows expert in your company just setting that up for you. In fact, what's happened lately is that to set up these virtual desktops, you don't necessarily need to be a heavy-duty IT person. Whoever your Windows app administrator is now probably has all the technical savvy necessary to do this. So that's through redirection technology. Okay.
So yeah, great explanation. Obviously, being able to print locally and utilize those resources are imperative.
Yep.
So HD video, something that's always talked about in terms of desktop as a service.
Yep.
What do you see a lot in terms of HD video? And then also, with regards to that user experience, the thing that was brought up here was, roaming profiles, for example. Maybe you can touch just briefly on both of those two items and how those can be associated to a desktop so that we're controlling that user experience.
Yeah, so HD video, high performance graphics, think of CAD CAM, simulation and modeling, the real processing and graphics intensive type of apps, even video editing. Believe it or not, that's all actually very, very possible and is being done today with desktop as a service and with desktop virtualization. In these cases, you do need to have enough bandwidth, and that's something that we can take a look at. So you do need to have, just healthy, decent network pipes. But the protocols themselves are capable of painting multiple HD videos on a single screen, so you could even have multiple windows open. In fact, some of these devices now, these thin clients, can support up to 4 high-def monitors, and you can open up a high-def video experience on each monitor simultaneously. So the desktop virtualization of today is vastly different from even 2 or 3 years ago. There's been tremendous progress made both in terms of the protocols and how the endpoints complement what's happening on the back end through a shared processing model. So for example, our latest WISE thin clients from Dell have these dual and quad core AMD processors inside them where they can actually offload through what we call video redirection so that the video can actually play locally with plenty of power to basically stand up multiple windows of very rich video in a virtual desktop session. Yep.
Yeah,
oh,
great.
and the roaming profiles. If you think about it, remember when you're doing a virtual desktop through DaaS or through on-premise, it is no different than using a PC at work. So anything that you can do from your PC, you can and should be able to do from your device that's accessing your virtual desktop. And that can be done from anywhere. Now, with these virtual desktop brokers, you can actually set up rules and policies that can enable or disable access. So here's a classic example, right? Somebody in your accounting organization wants to open up a financial spreadsheet. You may allow them to do that at work, but not from Starbucks where somebody could be looking over their shoulder. So there's great levels of kind of refinement and per group policy setting and enforcement that you can do with these virtual desktops.
Yeah, Dan, that's great. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong too, but we have a couple other questions tied into here. And I think you were touching basically on persistent versus, non-persistent desktops and how that can be, configured on a per user, per group basis. We're also talking a little bit more about, sessions being launched concurrently and can you allow or disallow? And the answer is, yes, of course. And then, of course, there's also timeout or lockouts, which of course can be configured on a per user, per group basis to either lock out after a certain amount of attempts or a certain amount of time. So there's certainly a lot of flexibility in the platform to really serve up a desktop environment and a user experience that's highly customizable.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, control is a huge factor in this. One of the funny complaints that we got from one of our customers in a virtual desktop environment was, I can't cruise the internet, they said. I just can't get to the internet. And the response to them was, do your job, you're a retail clerk. That's why you can't cruise the internet. So the beauty of this is that you can allow or disallow capabilities on a per group or per user basis. And for task workers, front desk clerk at a hotel, somebody working at the checkout counter in retail. These people, you want them to do their job and you want them to focus on that, and this gives you the capability. Now, for those of us who dare call ourselves knowledge workers, and I guess I'm going to lump myself in that category, we tend to have more freedom because in companies where people are running a typical office suite of apps, they can do that and you're less worried about that. All right, so let's move on. The next thing I wanted to talk about was what's driving organizations to consider this. I think through your great questions, we've covered a lot of this actually. Enabling mobility, right? Freeing people up from one device to get their job done and allowing them to be highly mobile while offering great security and protecting your content. Data loss prevention. We talked about that example of the New York banker who inadvertently forgot his laptop in the back of a cab. By securing your apps and content in the data center where you've got multiple layers of security and content protection, you've got a much better chance of preventing either purposeful or accidental data loss. And then finally, streamlining IT, making your IT organization more efficient, allowing your IT organization to become more strategic because they're not spending 80% of their time imaging and patching and updating PCs. These are just the kind of the main reasons. Oh, and then the other thing that's happening, the other phenomenon, you may have been reading about hyperconvergence. A hyperconverged system is nothing more than a single data center entity that is housing compute, power, storage, and if necessary networking, all within a single manageable physical entity. So we at Dell, we offer what we call hyper-converged infrastructure appliances. The reason I'm bringing this up is that these devices are extremely efficient and oftentimes are prescribed for specific numbers of users to take the guesswork and the mystery out of how do I configure my data center. And it also just happens to turn out that DaaS and VDI are a great workload for hyperconverged systems, and hyperconverged platforms are great platforms for virtual desktops. So you're going to be hearing more and more from Dell and from our partners about offering these types of services from hyperconverged platforms, because the traditional riddle with virtual desktops in the past was, gee, how much server horsepower do I need, right? Especially if I want to set up persistent desktops. How much storage do I have to buy? When do I need to buy more? How do I know what to do when I scale? And by taking the mystery out with prescribed hyperconverged systems for exactly up to 300 users. You want more, add another one, you get 600. You want more, add another one, you get 900. This predictable scalability allows you to not overspend, which is not good from a financial standpoint, or under-configure, which could result in unhappy users. So this is really kind of accelerating the adoption of DaaS as this move toward hyperconvergence. Okay, so so we've talked about what's prompting people to consider this. So what have been the traditional barriers, right? Number one has been, and some of your questions have alluded to this, right, is how will I keep my people happy? Someone's been using a PC for the last 3 years. They know that their apps come up instantly. They know how to get really good performance. How can I ensure that the same thing will happen if we flip some people over to virtual desktops? The answer to that one is you have to see it to believe it. That's why we will oftentimes recommend a proof of concept or a pilot, where you take a small group and start with them and then expand gradually from there. But the proof is in the experience, and we have plenty of customers who are running a rich application mix with lots of happy users. Time to adoption and time to value. With these hyperconverged systems, it turns out that you can get value very, very, very quickly. In fact, what used to take months could now be stood up in days by moving toward these prescribed appliance platforms, so that our partners like Dataprise can offer the service very quickly to anybody who desires it and then scale it out very quickly and very predictably. The cost to implement this is obviously, if you're doing it as a service, you merely need to deal with the recurring monthly cost, plus any endpoints if you wish to add thin clients. But if you're doing it yourself, there's always been concern about the cost to build out my back-end data center. And again, with the tools that we provide for planning and with hyperconvergence, that's really been mitigated extensively. And then finally, and this is a little bit ironic, this is the concern about security, right? A lot of organizations will say, well, wait a minute, how do I trust my apps and content to my provider or to my, by keeping everything in the data center and taking it off the desktops? It turns out that it's actually a more secure model for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And it's just something that, more and more organizations are starting to understand that by moving in this direction, they're actually more secure than they were before they did. Question?
Yeah, Dan, had two quick questions. I think one I can tackle was regarding when we were talking about all those security features and settings for the users. Question was, can those settings be controlled centrally from, Active Directory group policy, et cetera? Quick answer is yes, that's one of the benefits for adopting desktop as a service, ease of management. The second question was related to what are the determining factors to consider when choosing between on-premise VDI versus a subscription-based model?
Yeah, and this is, that choice is entirely up to you. And the things to consider, I think, number one is your IT organization. In some companies, the IT organization is not only super eager to embark on new projects, but the resources are there. And if that's the case, and if that's the way you typically operate, you may want to consider on-premise. But what we're noticing, especially to small to mid-sized companies who don't want or don't staff or don't have a big IT organization, nor do they wish to bring on more people to further beef up their IT, they may discover that the subscription model fits them perfectly because essentially all you worry about is your monthly subscription, and it's all outsourced to your provider, and you're adding no extra burden on your IT organization.
Sounds like something that we could probably touch on a little bit later too with the checklist with regards to kind of that total cost of ownership and really trying to analyze where that balance is between the CapEx versus the OpEx. So thanks, Dan. Appreciate that.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the types of companies, the types of agencies that are using DaaS, and the types of devices that are commonly used to do so. So not surprisingly, right, if we look at organizations that are moving this direction, it's organizations that are very, very concerned about security because either they have to comply with specific security and content protection or privacy mandates, or the nature of their business is one in which security is paramount. So if you look across this slide, and I'm not going to go into detail, I'm not going to read this to anyone, but there's a common thread here shared by all these types of organizations, and that is security, access control, and content protection. Healthcare, I mentioned before, the HIPAA requirements to protect patient confidentiality. That's critical for anyone who is working in the healthcare industry. Government, this one's kind of self-explanatory, right, with governments of all types, whether it's federal or local agencies, have to protect their content. Schools are part of what we call the public sector. Anyone who's a parent wants to make sure that their child's information is kept secure and not compromised. Schools are dealing with things like there's the security as it pertains to the students and the staff, but then there's also security as it pertains to fair testing and those types of practices. Financial services, banks, I don't think we have to go into much detail on this one. Obviously, banks care tremendously about security. And then retail. Again, I talked about the Payment Card Information Act, which says that retail organizations must protect the confidentiality and the information as it pertains to their customers. And we've all heard of some of the recent breaches. I won't even name the retail organizations, but there have been some breaches lately, which makes this top of mind. And then there's the, if you think about it too, in retail, oftentimes supermarkets, places like Target, they'll have pharmacies. Guess what? Those pharmacies have to adhere to HIPAA. So yeah, retail is a big area. So we actually, I think we want to do a poll now, or yeah, we'll do a poll and then.
Well, Dan, before you jump into the poll, what
Yeah.
about maybe some of the organizations that aren't listed here? Some of the hospitality we
Sure.
talked about.
Yeah,
we talked about legal and service organizations.
Yeah. By no means do we wish to imply that it's only these 5. In fact, a lot of just basic manufacturing companies are using DaaS and VDI. It is pretty big in hospitality. It's pretty big because if you think about it, there you've got different types of users. You've got task workers working the front desk. You've got the back office people who are working on the general business. We've got exploration and energy, believe it or not, is a big one because their intellectual property is in flight if someone's out on a remote drilling site, right? Any organization where their intellectual property, pharmaceuticals, working on the next big drug, for example, it covers almost any vertical you can think of. These top 5 that we're showing were the pioneers, but it's really spread across a wide swath at this point.
Yeah, great point, Dan. Thanks.
Sure. Okay, so what we want to do now is take a next poll, and this has to do with desktop recovery and business continuity. So the question is, do you currently have a desktop recovery / business continuity plan in place? Yes, no, or unsure. If you can take a minute to answer that question, we'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Very interesting, Dan. It looks like the yeses are outweighing the nos, which is always a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, so let's take a look at the breakdown. Okay, yeah. Most of you do, which is a good thing, obviously. The reason we asked the question has to do with where we're moving with the next thing I want to talk about is actually one of the reasons people will move toward this model is because if you think about it, if you have PCs that get compromised from a security standpoint, it's very difficult to recover for those specific devices. If you move your apps and content into the data center and just basically go with a DaaS service from your provider or stand it up yourself, the data center has that already built in, right? There's that disaster recovery, automatic backup, gives you a much stronger business continuity model.
Dan, speaking from my experience, I know we often talk about business continuity or disaster recovery from an infrastructure standpoint with regards to critical applications like email or SharePoint or SAP or accounting packages. But, speaking to DaaS technologies, this is really about the end user as well and making sure that not only are business critical applications back online, but then folks have a way to get back into those applications if they're displaced from their current place of business.
Yeah, what's happened is with the advancement of endpoints, with PCs becoming so powerful, you now have individuals who have tremendous IP responsibility right at their fingertips. And not unlike the gentleman who left his laptop in the back of a cab, you're much more exposed in terms of leakage. And oftentimes it's not malicious, it's just merely done by accident. So by sequestering your critical intellectual property inside the secure data center, you can do a lot to mitigate that from happening and making sure your business runs smoothly. Okay, next thing we wanted to discuss is the types of devices normally used to access your DaaS service. And the beauty of this is that you can use your existing devices, so you don't have to worry about having to do this big forklift change or upgrade to your endpoints. If you've got PCs and maybe you bought them a year ago and they're not nearly depreciated, by all means you can use them. However, if you want to look at a different model, one that is totally secure by design, you may want to consider what we call thin and zero clients. And these can be offered by Dataprise or your service provider as the endpoints by which you access the service. These devices look more like cable modems and wireless routers than they look like traditional PCs, but they've got all the connectivity you need. Ethernet, dual band Wi-Fi, bunch of USB ports. For the higher end users, we have DisplayPort interfaces, high def digital interfaces for a high def user experience. They can support multiple monitors, up to 4 in some cases. So anything you can get with a traditional desktop, you can get from one of these guys. The biggest difference, however, is that they are stateless devices with no moving parts. They use convection cooling, and they use between 6 and 15 watts of electricity. So if you move in this direction, you can create a much more energy efficient environment. So if you have any green initiatives going on within your company, this is a great way to save a lot of money on the endpoints in terms of energy usage. The other thing is that these devices tend to run for up to about 8 years. They can essentially double the refresh time. We have one customer, by the way, who's been using the same thin clients for 13 years. And we keep going back to them saying, hey, you've been a great customer, we'll give you a killer deal. And they say, go away, leave us alone. We like our thin clients. But the point is that they're highly reliable. They rarely break because there's no moving parts. However, obviously we talked about mobility. If you load the client on your laptop or on your tablet, you can access your apps and content from those devices or from traditional PCs. So the mix is typically dictated by use case, right? Oftentimes for task workers, right? We'll oftentimes have them use a thin or zero client because you get amazing control over those devices, all the way down to turning on or off USB ports or shutting down their browser, as was the example I gave earlier. Okay, so why move to DaaS in 2016? And this is a quick summary of what we've been talking about already. It's a great way to make business continuity and disaster recovery an embedded capability within your environment. You kind of get this automatically by moving your apps and content into the data center. Agility. If I need to reconfigure or patch or update hundreds or thousands of endpoints, it's much easier to do that by toggling some console parameters or doing a file drag and drop in the data center than it is to go out and visit all those machines. Simplify management. This goes to the previous point, right? I can set up policies and enforce them from a single place across my many departments or my many user types simply by doing it in one place on the console that manages all your virtual desktops. Satisfaction for your people, right? It's kind of funny. What we've noticed is when people first move to this model, they're very skeptical. They're going to say, how dare you take away my PC? What's this new thing I'm using? And then they quickly realize that, wait a minute, all their apps are where they should be. They behave exactly the same. What they see on their display is the same as it was before. And they quickly start to realize the benefit of being able to get to that stuff from anywhere, from home, from Starbucks, from their kid's soccer game, in an airport lounge, etc. Yep. Question?
Yeah, it looks like we have a good question, actually, and hopefully you can speak to this a little bit more. So desktop as a service over VPN is the question. Any known use cases that state this is a bad idea or bad experience? And the follow-up question would be, is the access to the DaaS environment all through a local FAT client, or can it be accessed via a web browser somehow?
Okay, so the first one is certainly through a VPN. That's up to you entirely, working with your provider. If you want to set up a secure VPN connection, that's fine. Not necessarily required, because oftentimes that's part of the service, right? So to access your virtual desktop.
Meaning that the connection is already encrypted,
yes,
correct?
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So that's just a choice, and that you just work that with your service provider, with Dataprise in this, for example. The second question had to do, can you remind me what the second part was?
Second question really speaks to different ways to access the desktop. So the question here specifically was, do you always have to connect through a thin or fat client, or can you also connect to the environment from a web browser?
Yeah. It's possible nowadays. There are actually some of the brokers will support HTML5 access. So you don't necessarily have to have the client loaded onto the machine. HTML5 is emerging as a mechanism by which you can get to that virtual desktop. So that'll depend on the browser that you're using, the environment that you're set up in, but in many cases that can be an option. Because if somebody doesn't have that client loaded onto their system and they still want to have access, it's still possible. Now, the experience may not be quite as feature-rich or robust from an HTML5 browser, but it's still another way to get to it from a device that just doesn't happen to have the client loaded onto it. Yeah.
Right, and that's typically due to the limitations in HTML5.
Right. Yep. Okay, the last point we want to make, I think, on this one is VDI can reduce downtime for your people because, again, they can get to all their apps and content and match that work style lifestyle mix to make them even happier and more productive. So at this point, I think we have another poll coming up, and in this case, the poll is for you to describe your user community, because your user community will dictate who you might flip over to the virtual model and who you may not, or how you might pace it over time. So if you can describe the people in your organization, and we've broken it up into 5 kind of categories. Your regular full-time workers, temporary or contract or part-time workers, people who work at a fixed location, they're stationary, and those who are highly mobile. And then finally, what we call task workers, people who are working places like call centers, front desks at hotels, etc. So if you guys can answer this, take the next minute to do that, and we'll see how the results come in.
So Dan, while they're taking a look at the different type, and of course we're just looking for, since it's a single choice, is,
yeah,
what are most of your employees going to be? Love to flip back to the questions, and of course, yes. So one of the questions we had here was, are the clients tracked per user seat license, or is this something that you could basically have like a floating license for? I think is kind of the question that we needed.
Yeah, so the licenses are per seats, but it's not tied specifically. It kind of depends on what your model is. So if you're going with a persistent model with persistent desktops, and by persistent what I mean is every time you log in, all your files and folders are exactly where you left them. It's exactly like using a PC. That's on a per user basis. However, there are other ways of offering the service, which is more of a shared model. And in that case, it's really just numbers of users who can be on it at any one point in time. You may have heard of things like a remote desktop session host from Microsoft or Citrix Zen app. Those are environments that are shared, so you get really great user densities at a very nice cost because you're not tying it to specific people. With a persistent model, you are, and in that case, it is on a per user basis. So it just depends on how you want to do that. Yeah. So let's take a look at the breakdown from that last poll. And yeah, so this is not surprising. Most people, almost the lion's share, about 3/4 of the responses are you have regular full-time workers. About 1/5, however, are fixed location and stationary, and a few of you guys said about 1/10 of your people are task workers. So this is not unlike the usual mix. The thing about those regular full-time workers, however, I would probably surmise that many of them are also mobile, and it was a little bit tough because I think you had to choose just one. But oftentimes the regular full-time people happen to also be highly mobile, and therein, you could get the benefit from going virtual from that perspective. And then if you've got task workers who are doing repetitive jobs where you want to have great control, oftentimes companies will start with those people first and then look at potentially expanding the DaaS to other users later after that. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on. When we look at desktop as a service, you always start with looking at your use cases. It's sort of like you want to plan for success, so you want to figure out what do my people need to be productive and get their job done. So every good DaaS or VDI implementation is only as good as the planning that goes into it. However, that's a service that you can take great advantage of. Folks like Dataprise can offer that to make sure that you're set up perfectly for your environment and your user types. Typically, we'll want to set up user profiles. Who's working in the front office, who's in the back office, who's mobile, who's temporary, what application mix am I offering to my people, and then we can map the appropriate form of desktop virtualization or form of DaaS for those specific users. The number of employees in the company. the needs of a small law firm will vary dramatically from that of a Global 500 company. The beauty of what's been happening recently with DaaS is that we've come up with these converged form factors that make it actually quite cost attractive to small companies who thought they couldn't even consider this in the past. Because you can start out with a small appliance, for example, that serves only up to 300 users. Smaller type companies, 600, 900, 1,000, etc. So you can actually now contemplate it even if you're a small organization. The line of business, if you're in government or retail or healthcare, you may want to take a serious look at this, or even just in general manufacturing if you've got critical intellectual property that you want to protect. And then security, we've already mentioned this, so I won't belabor this one, but if security and compliance are not an option for you, going virtual with those desktops can make that much, much easier.
So Dan, before you jump to the next slide, kind of one thing we were looking to accomplish here with this particular slide was, these are some things to get the thought process going in your head, some questions that can, you can have rolling around back there. You can start to, pull together some of this information. A lot of times a DaaS infrastructure, the planning, the work that goes into putting that together, it happens over multiple conversations, and a lot of times that happens even through the course of what's called a proof of concept. So, working with Dataprise, working with fellows like myself, we're here primarily to help not only answer these questions, but take a deep dive into your environment, your business applications, your user profiles. We're going to help you define who's going to be a good use case for desktop as a service, how to best get to that platform so that it's a seamless transition and there's no pain for your end users, or that pain is minimized. And also we're going to sometimes even recommend that you look at doing some type of a proof of concept, whether that's on equipment that you already have invested in your data center, or whether that's making a modest investment in a piece of equipment to then allow you to fully vet out and test a production proof of concept environment so that you can place your users into it and really get a feel for how it works, how it's managed, and how your users are going to have that experience. So, these are some of the basic preliminary things that we would want to call to your attention. And again, these are meant to help you lead into further conversation.
Yep, and the other thing, Chris, that you can also recommend is even the optimal endpoints based on user types and the application mixes and their peripheral needs. You can actually just recommend, hey, these people would be perfect for thin clients. These people keep on their PCs. These people keep on their mobile devices. All that is part of the planning process.
Yeah, exactly. And we even have a number of folks that choose to, wait till repurposed equipment, does have a hardware failure before they reinvest into a new device, be it a thin client, a tablet, whatever it is for that particular user that's a good fit and a good use case. And that oftentimes allows them to extend the functional lifespan of their investments that they already have. So good point.
Yeah, and that's why an upcoming PC refresh cycle, if you've got one on the horizon, for a lot of organizations, that gives them the perfect opportunity to take a step back and say, hey, this might be a time where I can give this some serious consideration. Okay.
I thought we'd do something a little special here today. I know we've talked about desktop as a service, and conceptually we've been able to pitch it and talk about it and really show you what it looks like, but I wanted to bring it to life. I wanted to take a moment here. So this yellow desktop that you're seeing, I'm just dragging this window down. This is the conference room that we're here. We're at the Rockville headquarters and technology center for Dataprise. This yellow desktop just happens to be the workstation that's in this particular conference room, and it has none of my personal information on it. All of the icons and everything that you see here, this is just the standard desktop that folks would see when they logged in to join a conference or participate.
So Chris, this is the physical device literally at your fingertips right now, correct? The yellow.
Correct. Yep. So the yellow desktop that you're looking at is a physical Dell workstation that's sitting here in the office, and I'm in front of it as we speak. So what's great is that I'll pull this window back up. I logged into my remote desktop a little bit earlier, So as you can see, this blue desktop here, I'll go ahead and maximize it. You can see this blue desktop, it has, excuse me, I'm sorry guys. It has all of my production applications, my email client, what I was working on prior to this meeting. I was on my laptop actually working, I'm hoteling from this particular office space because I live in Baltimore. So my office is in Baltimore. I'm hoteling in our Rockville headquarters this morning. I was using a laptop to connect into my virtual desktop infrastructure, whereby I was able to answer emails, work on some spreadsheets, do some web browsing. You can see that all of my normal applications that I use, files that I've worked on that I'm not supposed to be saving on my desktop are saved on. And this is all available to me. When it was time to come for the webinar this afternoon, I simply X'd out of my session, and you can see that when I logged back in on this particular desktop, all of my applications were right where I left them waiting for me, and I have no break in my workflow. Also, what I thought would be interesting, I can go ahead and close out of this session again. And there was a question regarding logging in using the FAT client versus the HTML5 client. So as you can see, I've logged into my Dell vWorkspace environment, and using this login, this is the traditional agent-based login, which, as Dan was talking about earlier, gives us that full feature access where everything that you would expect to be available on a workstation is available, meaning I have redirected printers, I can scan, local resources can be made available to me if I choose so. And over here you'll see HTML5 login. So what that means is that if I click on this, I'm now in a login screen where if I log in, which I'll do here in just a second, you'll see that I'm logging in through a web browser, no client is required, and I can then go ahead and access my applications. And this might be something that's done on a machine that doesn't have the agent installed. I'm out somewhere where I don't have administrative credentials to install the agent, or it's a public PC that I want to use, something that makes the access a little bit easier.
Okay, let's see. We have a question. If you consider piloting DaaS, how would you handle the situation of having a mix of actual machines and DaaS? So that's kind of the reason you would pilot it. In other words, you would basically, let's say you've got a small group, maybe it's order processing, right? And they're doing all their work on their PCs and they're clicking away and doing their thing. And you might say, look, you take half the group and move them on to DaaS. And what you would do is you would set up a profile for them which mimics exactly the application mix that resides on the PCs that they use. So that's part of the planning process. So even though there is a mix of what they're getting through DaaS and then what's accessible locally, you want to replicate that mix for those types of task workers so that everything they're getting through the DaaS service is what they're familiar with from an application standpoint that's residing on the PCs. And the point to be made here, because the question's a great one to make this point, you do not need to load new apps. You don't need to change stuff. Basically, you can get to any application mix as long as it's published for a virtual desktop, which just about any Windows kind of suite of applications. We also can help people if they've got custom-built apps to virtualize them on the back end. But you don't have to go out and get a bunch of new applications or upgrade your existing apps to take advantage of this. I hope that answered the question. Okay, next follow-on. So if a user has two concurrent sessions running to a persistent desktop, will they see the exact same thing on each sessions, also known as the same open file and or programs they had running? Let me think about this question for a second. Two concurrent sessions running to a persistent desktop. Normally when you log on to a persistent desktop, that's your one session, right? It's just like using a PC. So it's sort of like, well, what happens if you have two sessions running on a PC? The same thing should be happening on a virtual desktop. There's really no difference. So will they see the exact same thing on each session? They should if they just decide for whatever reason they want to have two concurrent sessions running on the same device. It's no different than what you would see on a physical PC. That's the way it's set up.
And to think about that a little further, for example, that can get to be a little troublesome if you're working inside of an Excel file. For example, you have two people trying to make changes to the same Excel file. You are going to run into some issues. So, you know, usually when planning and designing these types of environments, you know, if you're going to have concurrent logins for a user session, we try to talk about persistent versus non-persistent, what kind of applications we're serving up to that desktop, and to make sure that we're not overlapping those resources, meaning, you know, we don't want two changes being made to the same thing at one time, because you're going to end up either corrupting the, you know, the document or whatever it is you're working on.
Yeah, oftentimes in a shared environment with applications, you have the what's called the ability to check in or check out the application. So a perfect example is SharePoint from Microsoft, where, you know, you can set that up so that if anyone touches the app and wants to make edits, if they want to do it in the cloud or in the virtual desktop, they have to check it out, which means temporarily while they're manipulating that file, nobody else can touch it, right? It's read-only for everybody else. So, okay.
And just briefly before we jump to the next question, I know it's been a minute or two since you watched me log in, but you know, what you see now is this was the web browser that I logged into. I clicked on my desktop, and here inside of the Internet Explorer browser that I have open, in a new tab, you can see we just picked up the exact same session that I disconnected. So, you know, every application is exactly where I left it. I'm now browsing this from inside of a HTML5 web browser. So hopefully that helps to explain a little bit more. Again, same kind of functionality, where I can disconnect the sessions and kind of change from device and change from style of connection to get back into what we were talking about and working on. So that's kind of a way for you to see that and see it in production. I happen to use it every single day, so I'm well versed. But you know, I want to take a moment here, Dan, to jump into the next question. And just so everyone is aware, we're transitioning over to a question and answer session. So you've had a lot of great questions, a lot of great engagement throughout the session today.
Awesome.
You know, DaaS is a very, very complex environment and system to not only, you know, configure and manage, but you know, get your mind around and make sure that you understand everything that's there. So, you know, there's a lot of things at work here, and we want to make sure we give you guys some time. So, you know, we've got some time here at the end of the session. I have a question that's sitting out there that talks about how does the Dell DaaS product differ from the Microsoft Azure Remote Desktop Services, which it's a great question, and there's a little overlap there, but Dan, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, if you think about DaaS in its many forms, you know, you have Amazon, AWS, you have Microsoft Azure, Dell can offer this as a service, and our partners like Dataprise can offer the service. Essentially, they're all pretty much the same thing, where you are basically getting your application mix delivered to you based on the planning process that takes place with your service provider. Within Dell, you know, we see no conflict because we consider ourselves a technology dealer to the cloud. And we really don't care if that cloud is private, public, or hybrid. We do care that it's comprised of Dell gear. We like that to happen. That's a good thing for us. So we have no biases toward one model or the other, and that's why sitting down with your service provider to figure out what's the optimal model for you makes the most sense. But essentially, whether it's one of the super big well-known guys like Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services, or something offered directly from Dell or from somebody like Dataprise, it's essentially the same thing. Critical apps for your specific people, you just want to move them to the cloud, wherever that cloud is. Yep.
And Dan, I mean, in my experience, what we've really hit on is some of the nuanced differences just in how the back-end technologies vary slightly from provider to provider, from technology to technology. So, you know, while we talk about desktop as a service, which is really a large terminology, you know, when we talk about whether it's hosted with Azure and it's, you know, that's built on top of a Windows remote desktop server stack, and you serve up your applications and desktops from a secure Microsoft Azure infrastructure, or whether you choose to do it with Amazon Web Services or through Citrix or VMware or some of these other technologies that you can host or have hosted through a subscription provider, the difference are really circled around how to manage and maintain those environments. Obviously, with the larger third-party providers and providers like Dataprise, a lot of the infrastructure is fully managed for you. Everything from the hardware and the hypervisor and the back-end technology that's serving up that desktop, that's all fully managed, patched, maintained. It's redundant so that you at the end of the day have a desktop that's available for you. You don't have to question, you don't have to worry. We have folks that are very smart engineers that are working behind the scenes to do that for you. Same thing over with Microsoft and Amazon, although with those folks you typically get less access into and visibility into the back-end infrastructure. You're not managing anything, you're not getting control of anything on the back end. You're really just working through serving up your applications and your desktops.
Yeah, a very crude analogy, if you'll forgive me for using this, is if I get electricity, I don't know if that's coming through hydroelectric or nuclear or coal or some other mechanism or wind. All I know is that it's working. And the ideal with a DaaS service is that you as the subscriber, it kind of doesn't matter. You just care about making sure that your desktops are up and running and your people are happy. How it gets delivered is actually secondary to the level of insight you may be allowed from a management standpoint, but that's pretty much it. Everything else is basically under the covers, right? So. Yeah,
and I think to end on that note too, the closing thought that I would have is that myself as well as the team of very talented engineering folks that I work with here at Dataprise, we have an entire team dedicated to identifying what the right solution is for you and your organization. So our engineers, depending on how you answer the questions and how things are trending for you, we're going to be able to find that best fit solution based off of your exact needs. And we have folks that are well versed in all of the technologies that we've been talking about today. So again, kind of folding back into what we talked about at the beginning of the presentation with Dataprise, and being that one-stop shop for you, we want to be able to know these back-end technologies, provide you with that expertise, and help guide you into making that right decision. And we're pretty agnostic with regards to where that lands. Our goal is really to be a trusted advisor to you and your team and make sure that you understand the functional technologies behind what you're trying to accomplish. So, again, it's that one-stop shop mentality from Dataprise where we can certainly help you make these decisions, help you implement, and help you manage what works best for your company.
Yeah. And then just to add to that, Chris, we at Dell, as technology providers to Dataprise, we're in a very strong position when it comes to desktop virtualization technology in terms of back-end servers and storage, our hyperconverged appliances, the WISE thin clients. So we pass our expertise on to Dataprise, and Dataprise is using what we like to think is best-in-class techniques to deliver the service. So, yeah.
Great. Well, and I see here that that there's no more blips on the radar. The questions have kind of quieted down some. So I wanted to, if there's no additional questions, we're going to go ahead and conclude a few minutes early for you today, give you a little bit of time back before you have to jot off to that next meeting. I can't thank you enough for taking the time this afternoon to share part of your time with us and let us walk through this webinar with you. It's been an absolute pleasure. We're so excited about desktop as a service and being able to help you guys figure out what's going to be the best fit for you and your organization. I really want to thank Dan. It's been an honor and a privilege to work with you through this process, Dan. You're a true expert and a good friend as well. So thank you very much for spending some time with us as well this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. And I appreciate all the questions. It was really interactive, which makes for a good session. So I want to thank the audience for being so involved. It was great.